barrier. In 1921, Imamura began the English department, which left quite an impression on the Nisei.
I remember a white person, and he said he was Hunt. He came here and talked to us, and that was the first Sunday school conducted in English, and I thoroughly enjoyed.
I thought Honganji ministers were all Japanese, but you know, he was so different. It made a real impression, and he's somebody that I often think of for that reason.
By and large, Imamura's Americanization campaign was successful. By 1920, the Honpa Honganji had well over 100,000 members, 2/3 of all Japanese on the island. Its Hawaiian-born adherents outnumbering their parents, prompting Imamura to herald a new dawn in the golden age of Buddhism. Imamura had reason to be proud. Through 2 decades of hard work, Buddhism had become the dominant religion in Hawaii. By 1919, frustrations over discrimination, unfair pay, and living conditions were boiling over. The Japanese were 40% of the population, performing the majority of the work on the plantations. Yet they were at the very bottom of the plantation labor pool, carrying out the most menial jobs under the worst conditions for a mere 77 cents a day, significantly less than what the Portuguese and the Puerto Rican workers, mostly Christians, were paid for the same work. In December of that year, talk of a major strike spread through the camps. As it did, the Japanese community looked to the Buddhist leadership for support.
Imamura and other Buddhist priests want the conditions of their people to be better, so they do something that looks sensible to them and they support a strike.
It wasn't because of the religion they did it, but it happened that Buddhist Imamura had social views. He had views about equality, human rights. I think it was natural for him to stand with what he saw as the oppressed workers.
On February 2nd, 1920, 12,000 Japanese laborers walked out of the plantations on Oahu and began the Great Sugar Strike.
The 1920 sugar strike caused the Japanese communities to galvanize. And because it took a lot of organization, they really relied on the temples to support them.
The Buddhist temples are places in which people congregate to discuss the strategies for the 1920 strike. And it's very well organized. I mean, they really talk about, okay, we're going to go out on strike, they're going to kick us out of our homes, we're going to have to plan ways in which people are going to have to live.
They would have evening meetings. They would be eating dinner there. The wives and mothers would be cooking, cleaning, sewing, whatever it took to keep the society from falling apart.
The decision to support the strike drove a wedge between the Buddhist temples and their powerful supporter, the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association.
Religion did not become an issue until Imamura Sensei sided with the sugar strike, and then there was a conflict between Buddhism and the planters seeking land and so on to build temples. Then when the workers began to stand up for themselves, unionize and so on like that, then it became a different story. So look at all we did for you, and you're doing this.
Fear that the strike would decimate the economy of Hawaii, the planters used the press to recast the strike as a Japanese conspiracy to take control of the islands.
Oh yeah, there was concern that this was the leading wedge of an attempt by Japan to take over Hawaii.
When strikers held a parade on the same day as the Christian Centennial celebration, the press pounced. Although the workers carried miniature American flags, portraits of President Lincoln, and signs reading, "We want to live like Americans," the Pacific Advertiser dubbed the march an insult, claiming the strike was instigated by Buddhist priests who hate America, Americans, and American institutions. By the spring of 1920, the strike was weakening.
The planters basically outlast the Japanese strikers, and use non-Japanese as strike breakers. So there's Filipinos, Koreans, and some Hawaiians are used to help break that strike.
It cost the planters $12,1921, but they had won. The effect of the strike would change the public perception of the Japanese and the Japanese Buddhists in Hawaii. The 1920 sugar strike had reverberated all the way back to Washington, D.C. Believing that the strike was proof that the Japanese were unassimilable, in 1924, Congress signed the Immigration and Exclusion Act, ending Japanese immigration and preventing the naturalization of all foreign-born Japanese. This act crystallized a half-century of American concern over the political loyalty of the Japanese and their religions, Buddhism and Shinto.
Now the issue is nationalism. You know, is Buddhism an American religion, not so much culturally, but politically, you know, in terms of loyalty. Can a Buddhist be loyal to America in a political sense?
The issue of loyalty drove at the very heart of the religion. Japanese Buddhism was closely intertwined with Japanese culture. The territorial government was concerned that the Buddhist-run Japanese language schools were secretly teaching Japanese nationalism to American citizens. The government went about demonizing and regulating the language schools.
There was a campaign in the newspapers to try to have them closed because that was dangerous. Seditious, I don't know what word to use for it, but they regarded that as really problematic. If they're going to be Americans, they have to have their loyalties here.
In response to this criticism, Imamura began his Americanization campaign. He publicly announced that Buddhism could mold good American citizens because, like Christianity, it was for every nation and people. He also created a council to rewrite the Japanese language school textbooks.
In order to survive, the Japanese language school textbooks change their focus from talking about the shogun and Japanese mythological heroes and heroes to George Washington. The same language they're being taught now, but now they're being taught about American history.
These changes were not enough for the territorial government, and it imposed punishing restrictions on the schools, prompting a legal battle that would go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court rules, because it's looking at also German language schools from Nebraska, that it's unconstitutional for Hawaii to prohibit Japanese language schools to operate, that's the right of immigrants to teach their children their language.
It would be a major victory for Imamura and the Japanese Buddhists, but one that would be short-lived. The challenges facing the Buddhist community took a terrible turn in December 1932.
Imamura dies in 1932. It was so sudden. Unfortunately, there was no way to transition from Imamura to something else smoothly.
Imamura's tireless efforts to shape an American practice of Japanese Buddhism would also pass with him. Caught unawares, the main temple in Kyoto took months even to find a temporary replacement. They finally sent Bishop Gikkyo Kuchiba in 1935.
Bishop Kuchiba was an ardent nationalist. The new leader puts an end to some of Imamura's major attempts to try to Americanize Buddhism. He'd fired Ernest Hung. He'd shut down the English department. This is Japanese religion. Why do I have to do it in English? And so now we go backwards.
Honpa Honganji as a whole did not grow religiously very much after that.
Beginning in the late 19th century, Japan had begun to emerge as a world power.
1894, the Japanese go to war with China and defeat China. 1904-05, they defeat Russia.
In the Japanese-Russian War, they became the first Asian nation to royally kick butt on a European power. There's a lot of pride in that.
You beat Russia? That's amazing. Big celebrations in 1904 when Japan won the Russo-Japanese War. There's politics, there's race, there's all kinds of sentiment involved with the extreme pride for what Japan was doing.
Buddhism had also been swept up by the rising tide of Japanese nationalism.
Buddhism was persecuted in the 1870s, 1880s, and part of the way Buddhism redeemed itself was to become more nationalistic.
And so they developed an ideology of how Buddhism supports the invasion of China. Buddhism supports the colonization of Korea. Buddhism is not a religion of peace. It is a religion of how to win wars.
ハワイに来ていた僧侶の中でもその影響を受けた人がたくさんあった。そんな中でそういう影響を受けた人たちいうのは
At that time, the temples became really more patriotic towards Japan. So that's the period when a lot of these problems start to crop up for the Buddhist community here about loyalty and Americanism and all that kind of thing.
As the 1930s wore on, the Japanese Buddhists in Hawaii found themselves in a difficult position as relations deteriorated between America and Japan.
Even in 1940, there are memos and minutes of people who are saying, look, there's going to be a war, and it's going to be with Japan. There's going to be an enormous amount of race hatred going on. We have to work to try to